She'd been home 7 times since her wedding day, and she hadn't seen him, not once. Granted, she'd only been home for a few days at a time. She'd been into town, to the bar owned by her best friends, Colleen and Connor O'Rourke, but Jeremy hadn't shown up. He hadn't stopped by her family's house, though he did while she was away. People had gotten over the shock of his coming out, including her family, eventually. Jeremy had been a part of their lives too, not to mention their doctor and next-door neighbor, though next door was a mile away. But when she was home, he lay low. For the first 6 weeks after their non-wedding, she and Jeremy had called each other every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. Even with his stunning news, it was hard to believe they weren't together anymore. From the moment she'd seen him by her bedside in the nurse's office, for 8 solid years, she'd loved him without one moment's doubt. They were supposed to be married, have kids, have a wonderful long life together, and the fact that all those future decades were just whisked away, it was hard to wrap her heart around it. He tried to explain why he'd let things go so far. That was the hardest part. She'd loved him so much, they'd been best friends, and he'd never even tried to bring it up. He loved her. He said it repeatedly, and Faith knew it was true. Every day, every conversation, he apologized, sometimes crying. He was so sorry for hurting her, so sorry for not telling her, for not accepting what he knew in his heart. One night, 6 weeks after their wedding day, after they'd talked to each other in gentle voices for an hour, Faith had finally told Jeremy what they both already knew. They needed to truly break up. No more emails, no more calls, no more texts. "I understand," Jeremy had whispered. "I'll always love you," Faith had said, her voice breaking. "I'll always love you, too." And then, after a long moment, Faith had pushed the button to end the call. Sat there on the edge of the bed, staring into space. The next day, she'd been offered a freelance job working with a well-known landscape designer at a new marina, and her post-Jeremy life began. Her father had come out to visit 3 times that year, unheard of if you were a farmer, and Prue and the kids had come once. They all had called and written and texted. Forcing yourself out of love, it seemed impossible. Sometimes she'd forget. Someone asked her if she wanted kids, and her answer was, "We definitely do." And then came the slap of remembering that there would be no beautiful, smiling, dark-haired kids running through the fields of the 2 vineyards. And now, here in the old house, it was impossible not to think of Jeremy. Memories of him were everywhere. He'd sat on the front porch, promising her father he'd take good care of her. He'd pushed Abby on the swing when she was little, took Ned for rides in his convertible, flirted with Prue and Honor, had beers with Jack. He'd helped her repaint this very room the same pale lilac it was now. They'd kissed right in that corner. Lovely, chaste kisses, perhaps not what one would expect from one's 26-year-old fiancé, until Goggy had walked in on them and told them there was no kissing in her house. She didn't care if they were engaged. Faith had kept one photo of her and Jeremy, taken one weekend when they'd gone to the Outer Banks, the 2 of them in sweatshirts hugging, the wind blowing her hair. Jeremy's big smile. Every day she forced herself to look at it, and a small, cruel part of her brain would tell her to get over it. She hadn't deserved him anyway. But for those 8 years that they'd been together, it seemed that the universe had finally forgiven her dark secret, had presented Jeremy as a sign of absolution. Seemed like the universe had had the last laugh, and its agent had been Levi Cooper. Levi, who'd always judged her and found her ridiculous. Levi, who had known and never said a word.